Lena, a black assistant curator at the prestigious Art and Heritage Museum, had always kept a low profile. She loved art, believed in its power, and worked hard in a world where her voice often went unheard. But that changed one fateful afternoon when a homeless man caught her eye as he sat outside the museum's entrance. His clothes were tattered, his face weathered, but there was something in his gaze that made Lena stop. Without thinking, she offered him a bottle of water and some change. He smiled, a faint recognition in his eyes, and they exchanged a few words. But what Lena didn't know was that this man was Leopold Franco, a former art world legend, whose masterpieces were now worth millions. He wasn't just any homeless person. He was the person who would change her life forever. The next day, Lena was fired from her job. Her boss, Samantha Miller, had seen Lena's kindness as a distraction, unprofessional. But what she didn't know was that this simple act of compassion would set off a chain of events that would shake the art world to its core. What would you do if you were in Lena's shoes? Like, comment, and subscribe to follow Lena's journey as she discovers what happens next. Lena had always known the value of hard work. Growing up in a modest neighborhood where opportunities were often limited, she learned early on that nothing came easy. Yet it was in those early years that she also developed a deep love for art. Art was a world that allowed her to dream, to escape from the confines of her reality, and to see the beauty in the things that others might overlook. After years of struggling to find her place in the world, Lena had finally managed to secure a position as an assistant curator at the Art and Heritage Museum, a prestigious institution known for its rare collections and deep pockets. To most people, it would have been a dream come true. To Lena, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. But with this dream came a harsh reality. She was one of the only people of color in a world that was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly elite. She had worked hard to prove herself, learning the ins and outs of the museum, spending late nights cataloging collections, helping with exhibits, and assisting with special events. But there was always the subtle reminder that she was an outsider in this world, a world dominated by privilege and people who had never struggled a day in their lives. Her boss, Samantha Miller, epitomized the high society world that Lena had to navigate every day. Samantha had been with the museum for over 2 decades, known for her impeccable taste and for making deals with some of the richest art collectors in the world. She held immense power, and her approval meant everything in the cutthroat environment Lena had found herself in. Samantha had always been cordial but distant, and Lena often wondered if it was because of her race or simply because of the stark divide between their social positions. Either way, Lena knew her place. She worked hard, stayed out of the spotlight, and did her job without complaint. She kept her head down and followed the rules, believing that one day her time would come. But Lena had also been disillusioned. The art world, though beautiful, was often cruel and elitist. She had watched so many young, talented artists be overlooked because of their lack of connections or because they didn't fit the mold of what was considered appropriate in the upper echelons of society. And it made Lena feel like an imposter, like she was never truly meant to be part of it. Despite these feelings, Lena found solace in the work she did. She admired the art, the stories it told, and the way it transcended time. Her favorite piece in the museum was a small, forgotten painting tucked in the corner of a dark room, a work by an unknown artist that spoke to her soul. She would visit it on her breaks, standing in front of it for minutes at a time, allowing the brushstrokes and colors to speak to her in a way words never could. It reminded her of who she was, of her own silent rebellion against a world that often told her she didn't belong. One day, as Lena was leaving the museum for her lunch break, she noticed an elderly man sitting near the museum steps. His clothes were ragged, his hair long and matted, and he looked out of place in the polished, pristine surroundings of the museum. People walked by without giving him a second glance, ignoring him as they hurried on with their busy lives. Lena, however, couldn't just ignore him. She had always been the type of person to notice the things others overlooked. Her entire life had been spent in the shadows, and she knew what it felt like to be invisible. Without hesitation, she approached the man. "Excuse me, sir," she said, offering him a bottle of water from her bag. "Would you like something to drink? It's a hot day." The man looked up at her, his eyes tired but filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not many people stop to help." Lena smiled. "I know how it feels," she said, her voice kind but firm. "Sometimes, it's the little things that make the difference." As they spoke, the man began to tell her stories of his life. He was a painter, he explained, though he hadn't painted in years. His fingers had become too stiff, his mind too clouded. Lena found herself listening intently, asking questions, and slowly the conversation shifted. He shared how the world of art had once welcomed him, how his work had been featured in galleries, but how the fame and fortune had slipped through his fingers, how time and circumstance had turned him into someone forgotten. His name, he told her, was Leopold Franco. Lena blinked, surprised. Leopold Franco, the name rang a bell. He was a former art world icon, a renowned artist whose work had been sought after by collectors around the world. His pieces were known for their vibrancy, their expression of human emotion. His paintings had been sold for millions, but no one had heard from him in years. She felt a rush of surprise and confusion. Why was this man, this legend, sitting here on the steps of the museum? Before she could ask more, the conversation was interrupted. Samantha Miller appeared at the door of the museum, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Lena sitting on the steps with the homeless man. "I don't think this is the place for a break, Lena," Samantha said, her tone icy. "The museum needs to maintain its image, and this isn't how we do things here." Lena stood up, the warmth of the moment fading. She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? She had just offered a moment of kindness, but Samantha was already turning her back, signaling for her to return to her duties. Feeling humiliated, Lena nodded and walked back inside, her heart heavy with the weight of the situation. She didn't know what to think. Why was Samantha so cold? But what Lena didn't know was that the man she had just spoken to, Leopold Franco, wasn't just any homeless man. He wasn't just someone to pity. He was the key to everything she had ever dreamed of. As for Samantha, she had no idea just how badly she had underestimated the power of kindness. She would soon find out that her actions toward Lena and her ignorance of the man's identity would change everything. Lena couldn't shake the memory of her encounter with the homeless man, Leopold Franco. She replayed their conversation over and over in her mind, wondering what had happened to him, why he had fallen out of the art world, and why he had ended up on the streets. He had spoken so gently, with such knowledge of art, that it felt like the world had forgotten a treasure. But in the days that followed, Lena's life began to shift in a way she hadn't expected. Samantha Miller had barely acknowledged her after their brief exchange outside the museum. Samantha's indifference to her act of kindness had stung. It wasn't the first time Lena had felt dismissed by her. Samantha had always maintained a distance, as though Lena were just a part of the background, easily overlooked. Lena tried to focus on her work in the museum, but something about the atmosphere had changed. She wasn't the same anymore. Her mind wandered back to the homeless artist and the words he had shared. She had helped him, and in doing so had let herself become vulnerable to the judgment of someone like Samantha, who valued the museum's image above everything else. Still, she couldn't help but feel proud of herself. Her heart was in the right place, and that was something Samantha couldn't take away. But just as Lena was coming to terms with the idea of standing by her decision, the email came. Subject: immediate termination. Lena stared at the email notification on her screen, her heart sinking into her stomach. She had been expecting it, but it didn't make it any easier to read. Samantha had officially let her go. Her act of kindness had cost her job. The email stated that her actions outside the museum were deemed unprofessional and a distraction to the institution's mission. There was no mention of the fact that Lena had done something genuinely humane, just an insistence that it compromised the museum's image. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. This wasn't who she was. She wasn't going to let this define her. After all, She had helped someone. What was so wrong with that? She had done something right, and it was Samantha who had lost sight of what mattered. Just as Lena was about to turn off her computer and leave for the day, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Leopold Franco? I know you were wondering why I was there that day. I want to meet. I think we can help each other. My gallery opens next week. If you're interested, come by. Lena's fingers trembled as she read the message. She didn't know what to think. Was this real? Could he really be the artist he claimed to be? After a few minutes of hesitation, she responded, I'd love to meet. I'll come by. The next day, Lena made her way to the address Leopold had sent her, a small, tucked-away building in a neighborhood she had never been to before. She wasn't sure what she expected, but what she saw when she entered was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The walls of the gallery were lined with bold, colorful pieces of abstract art landscapes and hauntingly beautiful portraits. The work had an almost magnetic quality, and as Lena stepped further inside, she felt as though she had entered a different world. Leopold was there, standing in front of one of his larger canvases, his worn clothes a stark contrast to the richness of his paintings. You came, he said, his voice warm, though there was a hint of exhaustion behind his eyes. Lena nodded, unsure of what to say. Your work, it's incredible. I didn't realize you were the artist behind all of this. Leopold smiled softly. Many people didn't, but it's not about the recognition. It's about creating something that speaks to people, that can change the world, even just a little. He gestured to the paintings surrounding them. These are my stories. I never stopped creating, but I stopped showing. The world is quick to forget the things that don't fit into their vision of success. Lena took a deep breath, realizing something she hadn't fully understood before. You've been forgotten, but you're still here, and your work is still incredible. Leopold's eyes glinted with something unspoken. That's why I wanted to meet with you, Lena. You remind me of myself when I was younger. You have a fire inside you. You're someone who sees the beauty in the world, despite everything trying to hide it. He paused, studying her. I can help you, Lena. You've been pushed aside, just like I was, but I have a plan. Lena's mind raced. A plan? What did he mean? He walked her over to a series of blank canvases in the corner. I'm starting a new gallery, one that will showcase new talent, artists who have been overlooked, people like you, people who are dismissed before they even have a chance to shine. I'm offering you a position, not as an assistant curator, but as someone who will shape the future of art, someone who will bring overlooked voices to the forefront. Lena couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had just been fired, cast aside by the museum for doing the right thing, and now this artist, this man who had been forgotten by the world, was offering her the opportunity of a lifetime. But as she absorbed his words, Lena couldn't ignore the weight of the decision. Could she leave the security of the museum, the place she had worked so hard to be a part of, and take a leap into the unknown? Was this her moment to rise, to create something truly meaningful? Leopold watched her closely, as if waiting for her answer. The world isn't going to give you what you want, Lena. You have to take it, and I believe you're ready for this. After the confrontation in the park, everything seemed to change for Lena. The walls she had worked so hard to build, the ones that kept her hidden, kept her quiet in the face of injustice, began to crumble. The museum no longer felt like a place she could just blend into. It had become a battleground, one where she had to fight not just for her career, but for her dignity, for what she knew was right. For the next few days, Lena avoided her boss, Samantha Miller. She couldn't stand the idea of facing her again, not after what had transpired. But that wasn't her biggest problem. Her biggest problem was the reality of her situation. She had been fired, humiliated, and now she felt trapped. Leopold's unexpected kindness had stirred something inside her, but it also left her feeling conflicted. The painting he'd given her was amazing, breathtaking, really, but what was she supposed to do with it? Should she frame it and hang it in her apartment, or did it symbolize something greater? A week passed before Lena finally found herself outside the museum again, the familiar walls almost taunting her as she approached. She needed closure. She needed answers. And more than anything, she needed to stop feeling powerless. Inside the museum, things were beginning to unravel. Samantha Miller's reputation was on the line, and Lena knew that the tension in the air had nothing to do with her firing. The higher-ups were starting to ask questions. They had learned of Lena's public confrontation with Samantha, and they wanted answers. Lena stood at the gates, looking at the entrance she once walked through every day. She felt a mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, regret, hope. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was certain of one thing: she wasn't going to just walk away. With determination, she walked through the doors and headed for the main office. It was time to face Samantha. She wasn't going to allow her to sweep everything under the rug and pretend this was just a matter of a bad decision. As she walked past the galleries, her mind wandered to the painting in her apartment. Leopold's painting. She'd hung it on the wall of her small studio apartment. It had become a constant reminder of her decision that day, of standing up, of making a choice. But it was more than that. It was a symbol of her ability to change the course of her own life. The office door opened in front of her with a loud click. Samantha Miller sat at her desk, papers neatly arranged, her sharp eyes scanning the room, when Lena entered. "Well, Lena," Samantha said, a strained smile forming on her face, "I didn't expect to see you here again. What can I do for you?" Lena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped her chest. "I need to talk about what happened. I've been fired unjustly, and you know it." Samantha's expression hardened. "We don't need to rehash that, Lena. You've made your point. The board has been notified of the situation, and they're considering their options." "Considering their options?" Lena echoed. "What does that even mean? I helped someone. I helped an artist. Why is that a problem?" Samantha's gaze faltered for a brief second, but she quickly recovered. "It's not about helping, Lena. It's about professionalism. You embarrassed the museum, and you're still associating yourself with that man. A homeless artist, what kind of image does that give us?" Lena could feel the heat rising in her chest. "That man," she said slowly, her voice deliberate, "is Leopold Franco. A name you wouldn't know if you weren't so busy climbing your ivory tower. He's one of the greatest artists this world has ever seen, and he gave me one of his paintings." Samantha's face froze for a moment, and the room fell silent. "What?" she finally said, her tone shifting, incredulous. Lena took a deep breath and moved to the desk, slamming the painting down in front of her. "This," she said firmly, "this is what you don't understand. You had no idea who he was. You saw him as nothing but a homeless man, but he is someone who deserves respect. I'm done being silent, done being invisible." Samantha stood up, her face a mix of shock and fury. "You've gone too far now, Lena. You're not just undermining me, you're undermining the museum's entire legacy." Lena shook her head. "No, Samantha, I'm not undermining anything. I'm finally standing up for what's right, for what I believe in. And you," she pointed at the painting on the desk, "you can't silence me anymore." Samantha stared at her, the silence between them hanging thick. And then, just as Lena thought the situation was about to boil over, a voice from the doorway interrupted the tension. "I think you're both missing the point." Lena turned, startled. It was Leopold Franco, standing in the doorway of the office. He had come to the museum uninvited. His presence was undeniable, and his confidence filled the room. Samantha's eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" Leopold stepped forward, his gaze shifting between Lena and Samantha. "You've made a grave mistake, Samantha. You think art is about prestige, about power, about names on a list. But you've forgotten what art really is, what it represents. It's about humanity. It's about truth. And you've tried to silence the truth." Samantha looked flustered, trying to regain control. "Leopold, you? Don't try to lecture me on art, Samantha. You've been running this museum as a business, but it's time to remember what it's meant to be. This museum was built to tell stories, not to hide behind walls of exclusivity." Lena's heart raced as she watched Leopold confront Samantha. Her eyes filled with realization this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire art world, about the voices that had been ignored for so long. Lena's world had never felt more out of control. The confrontation in the office with Samantha Miller and Leopold Franco had ignited something within her, something that demanded to be heard, to be acknowledged. But instead of feeling empowered by her actions, she was left shaken and vulnerable. The next few days were a blur. Samantha retaliated quickly, pushing the museum's board to escalate her termination, questioning Lena's professionalism and conduct. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread, and suddenly Lena was a name whispered behind closed doors. The art world, especially the museum community, was one that thrived on exclusivity, on maintaining a perfect image, and Lena's actions had broken that facade. As if the pressure of losing her job wasn't enough, Lena felt like she had been abandoned by the very system that she had worked so hard to be a part of. She was faced with the harsh reality that, despite her best intentions, the world she had poured her heart into had little tolerance for people like her. Her apartment, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of failure hanging heavily in the air. She had lost everything: her job, her security, the sense of purpose she had worked for. And for what? A moment of kindness to someone in need? Lena sat on her couch, the painting Leopold had given her in the corner of her room, a constant reminder of her decision. She wanted to scream, to give up, but something inside her refused to let go. She had made the right choice, but was it enough? The phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. Lena picked it up, expecting to see another message from a well-meaning friend offering sympathy. Instead, it was a call from Leopold. "Lena," his voice was calm but firm. "I know you're struggling right now, and I know you're questioning everything. But this is the tipping point. This is where we see if you're really ready to take the next step to make a difference." Lena's throat tightened. "I don't know what to do, Leopold. Everything I've worked for has been torn down. I'm not sure I can keep fighting." "You can and you will. You're stronger than you think. You were fired for standing up for what's right, for being human in a world that values prestige over truth. But you have something they'll never have, Lena. You have the power to change things." Lena sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. She was fighting against the system, but it wasn't just the museum that had failed her. It was the entire structure of an art world that had always been built on exclusion. She had been fighting for a place at a table that had never been meant for her. But maybe there was a new table she could create, one where her voice and the voices of others like her would finally matter. The next morning, Lena made a decision. She couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't allow herself to be buried under the weight of the museum's rejection, under the power of Samantha's disapproval. Lena called Leopold. "I'm ready. Let's do this." He was silent for a moment, and then he spoke with conviction. "You're ready, Lena. But it's not going to be easy. We're going to create something different. A new gallery, a new platform. A space where artists like you and like me can thrive." Lena nodded, as though hearing his words solidified her decision. She wasn't going to let the system break her. She was going to build a new one. Within weeks, Lena and Leopold began working together on a project that would completely reshape the art world. The gallery they envisioned wasn't just about selling art. It was about telling stories, the stories of the overlooked, the marginalized, the people whose voices had been silenced by the elitism of the traditional art world. Lena started reaching out to artists, especially those who had been forced out of galleries or ignored because they didn't fit the image of what the world considered high art. These were people who had fascinating stories, who had created pieces that challenged the norms of society. They were poets, painters, sculptors, street artists. All of them had one thing in common. They had something to say, and they deserved to be seen. However, as Lena dove deeper into this new venture, she quickly realized that creating a new art space was no easy feat. The pressure was mounting, and she found herself having to convince galleries, collectors, and curators to take a chance on artists who weren't part of the establishment. Her once secure world was now filled with uncertainties. Leopold had been right. The world wasn't going to hand her success. She had to fight for it, and in the process, she learned the true meaning of resilience. One day, as Lena walked through the streets of the city, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it, and her heart skipped a beat. It was an invitation. Subject: Private Viewing Art and Heritage Museum. Invitation only. Lena's jaw clenched as she read the message. The museum was holding an exclusive event, one that would feature a handful of art collectors and investors. It was an event that could mean something huge for her. Could she use this as an opportunity to show them what she had been building? Her mind raced with possibilities. If she could pull this off, it would be the breakthrough she desperately needed. Lena called Leopold. I have an idea. I know this event is exclusive, but I think we can make a statement. I want to bring our gallery, our artists, into the spotlight. We're going to show them something they didn't expect. That night, Lena prepared. She was no longer just fighting for her own place in the art world. She was fighting for everyone who had been excluded, for everyone whose voice had been ignored. It was time for her to take control. Lena had never felt so alive, so driven by purpose. The idea of hosting her own event within the Art and Heritage Museum had seemed crazy at first, but now it felt like the only way forward. Her mind raced with the possibilities. What if this was the moment that changed everything? What if she could make the world see what she and Leopold Franco had been working toward? A new kind of art world, one where authenticity and inclusion were at the forefront. The day of the private viewing arrived, and Lena's heart raced as she walked into the museum. Her thoughts were a storm of excitement and anxiety. She had never organized something this big. The Art and Heritage Museum was notorious for its exclusivity. Invitations to their events were given only to the elite, the millionaires, the collectors, the power players of the art world. Lena knew that in a world built on connections and exclusivity, she had to take a massive risk to break through. As she walked through the entrance, the familiar feeling of the museum's grandiose marble floors and high ceilings seemed different today. It wasn't just about the space anymore. It was about what the space represented: the history, the legacy, and the potential for change. Lena had been working for weeks to prepare, collaborating with Leopold to bring in unheard-of artists, those whose works had been marginalized or dismissed because they didn't fit the mainstream idea of fine art. There was Jamal, a graffiti artist from Brooklyn who had turned his struggles into vibrant, emotional pieces that challenged political and social norms. Sarah, a self-taught sculptor from a low-income neighborhood, whose work was a striking commentary on race and gender. Aisha, a young portrait painter who had faced racial and cultural rejection, yet had persevered to tell the stories of Black women through her work. These were the artists who had been denied the right to exist in these spaces before. Now, Lena was determined to give them their moment in the spotlight. As the evening wore on and guests began arriving, Lena felt a nervous excitement building. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the final test, not just for her, but for everything she had worked for. This event would either make or break her. The museum's elite guests began to trickle into the grand hall, their hushed conversations and soft clinking of glasses filling the room. They walked past the museum's usual exhibitions, works by famous artists, before finding themselves drawn to the new section of the gallery. At first, the contrast was stark. The usual polished masterpieces were replaced by raw, unpolished, emotional works of art, paintings that conveyed deep stories, sculptures that challenged perspectives, and installations that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. Lena stood off to the side, nervously watching as the guests wandered through. She couldn't help but overhear a few whispers, some of them skeptical, others intrigued. "Who are these artists? I've never seen work like this here before," one of the guests murmured. "I think this is a new initiative. The curator who organized it is that new girl, Lena, right?" "The one who was fired," another guest responded, though their tone was dismissive. "Not sure what she's trying to prove." Lena's stomach tightened. She had heard those comments before. The skepticism, the quiet dismissal, the new girl trying to change things. But this time, there was something different in the air. Something shifted. The more people looked at the art, the more they seemed to feel it. The room was no longer just filled with people admiring pieces for their financial value. They were actually engaging with the work, reacting to it emotionally. Lena took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment she had been fighting for. Then, as the night continued, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. Samantha Miller, the very woman who had fired her, walked into the room. Her sharp eyes scanned the gallery with a mixture of curiosity and condescension, as though she were trying to figure out what had happened to the museum's carefully curated image. But what caught Lena off guard wasn't just Samantha's presence. It was the look of discomfort on her face as she walked past the paintings of unknown artists. It was clear she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected people to react to the art, to feel something deeper than just admiration for its value. Samantha walked up to Lena, her expression now softer, as if trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism. "Lena," she said with forced politeness, "I see you've really outdone yourself tonight." Lena smiled, her voice calm. "Thank you, Samantha. I knew I had something different to offer." Samantha's eyes narrowed, and she hesitated before speaking. This is bold, but I'm not sure if it's enough. You've brought in work that's unconventional. Are these really the kinds of pieces we should be showcasing here?" Lena stood taller, the sting of Samantha's previous rejection still raw, but now replaced by something else. Confidence. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away. "This isn't about showcasing what's acceptable, Samantha," Lena said firmly. "This is about art, real art. The kind of art that tells the truth, that connects with people, not just because it's fashionable or trendy, but because it reflects the world we live in." Samantha glanced at one of the portraits. Aisha's painting of a black woman looking directly at the viewer, her eyes defiant and proud. For a moment, Lena could see that Samantha was actually processing it. She was engaging with the art, maybe for the first time, with an open mind. But the moment quickly passed. Samantha's gaze shifted back to Lena, her expression guarded. "I still don't know if this fits the museum's image, Lena," Samantha said, almost nervously, but there was something else in her voice, a slight hesitation, a crack in her confidence. Lena took a step forward, not backing down. Maybe it's time the museum's image started to change. Maybe it's time art started to reflect the world as it truly is, raw, unfiltered, full of stories that matter. The silence between them was thick, but something had shifted. Lena had said what needed to be said. As the evening wore on, more people began to talk. There were still some skeptical glances, but there were more conversations happening, real discussions about the art itself. Leopold's name was whispered throughout the gallery, and the pieces he had provided started to gain recognition. The atmosphere in the room shifted from judgment to appreciation, from skepticism to acknowledgement. And then it happened. One of the wealthiest art collectors in the room, known for his influence and high-profile art acquisitions, approached Lena. "I've been watching this exhibition," he said, his voice low. "I have to admit I was skeptical at first, but there's something here. I want to purchase one of these pieces for my collection, not just because of its potential value, but because it has meaning. I'd like to help you, Lena. I'd like to see more from these artists." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she smiled, realizing that this was the validation she had been seeking. This was the turning point. The world had finally begun to see what she had always known, that art wasn't just a commodity, it was a reflection of life, of truth, and of people's stories. The night had ended in a whirlwind of emotions for Lena. As the final guests filed out of the museum, she stood quietly by the entrance, still processing everything that had happened. The world had finally begun to recognize the truth she had known all along. Art was about more than just wealth, prestige, and reputation. It was about expression, connection, and authenticity. But as the high from the evening began to fade, Lena felt the weight of what she had set in motion. This was only the beginning. She had challenged the status quo, and now she had to face the fallout of doing so. The following morning, Lena received a message from Leopold. He had stayed for the whole event, quietly observing as people interacted with his work. Lena had seen the pride in his eyes as his paintings gained appreciation. Yet, She also knew that he was waiting to see how the world would respond to this new gallery and this new approach to art. The message was simple, but profound. You've made a statement, Lena, but now you have to prove it. They'll come for you, mark my words. Lena knew what Leopold meant. In the art world, true change was never met with open arms. It was met with resistance, with harsh criticism, with those who felt their power slipping away. Samantha Miller, no doubt, was already preparing her counterattack. Lena walked into the museum. The next morning, the doors that had once felt like a place of opportunity now felt like an arena. The lobby was filled with whispers, the high walls echoing the murmurs of the elitists who had seen the new exhibit. Some were impressed, but many were still unsure. Samantha Miller was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't long before Lena's phone buzzed and the dreaded call came in. It was from the museum's board. Lena, the voice on the other end said, sharp and direct, "We need to talk. The board's decision on your future at the museum is being reviewed. Your actions have created a significant disruption. This isn't just about you. It's about the reputation of the institution." Lena swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I did what I thought was right. The museum can be more than it is. It can be a place where art speaks to people, not just to the wealthy elite." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "This isn't about art, Lena. It's about control. It's about what this museum stands for. You've crossed a line. We can't afford to let this go unaddressed. You'll be receiving formal notice soon." The line clicked off before Lena could respond, leaving her standing there, feeling the crushing weight of her decision. She had expected some backlash, but hearing the finality in the board member's voice made it feel real. She was losing everything again. The following days were a blur. Lena's termination was confirmed, and she was officially out of the museum. It was a shock, but it didn't feel like the crushing blow it should have been. It was a blow, yes, but it also felt like a weight lifted. Now she was free to build the world she had always imagined. But the consequences didn't stop there. The news of Lena's firing quickly spread beyond the museum walls. Art critics, bloggers, and journalists picked up the story. The Art and Heritage Museum was now at the center of a controversy. The institution that had once been seen as a bastion of exclusivity was now embroiled in a scandal involving a fired curator and a homeless artist. The media coverage was relentless, and the art world's elite began to turn their attention to Lena. Some supported her, calling her a pioneer in an industry that desperately needed reform. Others, however, were quick to dismiss her as an idealistic troublemaker, a young woman who had ruined a perfect institution for the sake of her own agenda. In the midst of it all, Leopold Franco continued to support Lena. He publicly praised her actions, calling her a true artist who understood the value of art beyond money and status. His words struck a chord with many, but they also attracted the ire of the powerful art world elite. The first public fallout came when one of the museum's largest patrons, a wealthy investor named Charles Weston, withdrew his multi-million-dollar donation. The museum felt the sting, and Samantha Miller knew this was only the beginning. The money, the power, the influence they had spent years cultivating, it was all starting to slip away. Samantha didn't waste any time. She was determined to salvage what little control she could, but Lena was already several steps ahead. Leopold's offer to help her build a new gallery had resonated deeply with Lena, and she had already made up her mind. She was going to follow through with the vision she had started, no matter the cost. 3 weeks later, Lena stood in front of an empty building. This was it, her new gallery space. The walls were bare, but in her mind, she could already see the art filling them, bringing them to life. She could see the work of the artists who had been ignored for so long, the voices of the underrepresented, the stories of those who had never been given a chance. Leopold stood next to her, his quiet support unwavering. He didn't say much, but his presence was enough. They were in this together. Lena was no longer just a curator. She was a leader who was going to build a space where art would truly be for the people, where creators who had once been overlooked would finally have the chance to shine. The opening of the new gallery was small, but it was packed with energy. Artists, critics, and activists crowded into the space, eager to see what Lena had created. Her vision was alive now, and it was contagious. The work on display wasn't just about beauty, it was about history, struggle, identity, and hope. The first piece on display was a portrait by Aisha, one of the artists Lena had championed. The powerful image of a black woman standing tall, her gaze fixed straight ahead, confronted the viewers with the undeniable message of empowerment and resistance. Lena watched as people moved through the space, pausing to look at each piece, engaging with the art in a way she had never seen before. She felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She was building something real. That night, as the gallery doors closed and the last of the guests left, Lena felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had lost everything, but in losing it all, she had gained something far more important. Her voice, her purpose, and the art world was about to change because of it. The first few months after opening her new gallery were a whirlwind. Lena worked tirelessly, pouring her heart into every exhibit, every artist, and every conversation. What had started as a small act of rebellion against the art world's elite had now evolved into a movement, a platform for marginalized voices that the traditional art world had ignored for far too long. Despite the challenges, Lena was seeing the fruits of her labor. Her new gallery, which she had named the Voice of Art, had begun to attract attention. The art community, which had once dismissed her as an idealistic troublemaker, was now starting to take notice. Not just the local community, but international art critics and major players in the art industry were beginning to talk about her. It was a quiet revolution. The first breakthrough came when an art critic named David Halston wrote an article in one of the leading global art magazines, Art Connect. The article, titled A New Era for Art: How Lena Matthews is Reshaping the Art World, praised the gallery for its bold approach to inclusivity and for elevating voices that had long been silenced. David's words were like fuel to the fire. He praised the raw, unfiltered emotion in the works displayed, how they spoke directly to issues of race, identity, and social justice. He acknowledged that Lena had brought a new perspective to the table, and her courage to take a stand against the elitism of the traditional art world was exactly what the industry needed. Lena Matthews has opened the door to a new world of art, one where the worth of a piece is not determined by who is selling it, but by what it speaks to. The Voice of Art is not just a gallery, it is a statement that art belongs to everyone, not just the privileged few. The article hit like a storm. The next day, her gallery was flooded with inquiries. Artists who had been overlooked for years, some even discouraged from pursuing their dreams, reached out to Lena. They wanted to be a part of her movement, to have their voices heard. The demand to showcase their work at her gallery was overwhelming. But it wasn't just artists who reached out. Collectors and investors, the very same ones who had once dismissed her and her vision, were now interested. Some were hesitant at first, but after seeing the impact the gallery was making, they came to realize that this was where the future of art was heading. It was a sunny afternoon when Lena received a call from one of the most prestigious art auction houses in the world, Christie's. They had been following the success of the Voice of Art and were interested in discussing an exclusive collaboration. Their offer was clear. They wanted to help sell the works of some of Lena's artists at their upcoming auctions. Lena was speechless. This was it. The kind of recognition she had dreamed of but had never imagined would come. For years, she had fought for equality in the art world, for an equal playing field, but now she was being invited into the very heart of that world, the world that had always made her feel like an outsider. The collaboration with Christie's took months to finalize, and by the time the auction day arrived, Lena felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The entire gallery had been buzzing with energy. Artists like Aisha, whose portrait of a black woman had caused waves of conversation, would be showcased to an audience that had once been closed off to her. As she entered the grand auction hall, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The room was filled with the most powerful collectors and art influencers in the world. They had gathered for a night of bidding, but tonight was different. This wasn't just about buying art, it was about changing the way art was valued. The gallery's pieces, many of which had once been dismissed by the mainstream, were now on display for everyone to see and appreciate. Lena stood at the back of the room, watching as Aisha's portrait was put on the block. The auctioneer started the bidding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have a truly remarkable piece here tonight. This is a work by Aisha Cole, a self-taught artist whose unique approach to portraiture has garnered global attention. We are honored to offer her work here tonight." The bids started low, but as the auctioneer continued, they began to climb. The room buzzed with excitement. This was no longer just a transaction. It was a moment where the art world was recognizing the talent, the stories, and the experiences that had been ignored for too long. When the hammer finally came down, the portrait had sold for an amount that stunned everyone. The entire room was silent for a brief moment before erupting in applause. Aisha's work had just sold for over $100,000, a price that would have been unimaginable just a few months ago. Lena stood in the back of the room, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The art world had just turned its gaze toward the artists she believed in, and they were no longer invisible. The following months were filled with more recognition. Leopold Franco's work continued to rise in prominence, and Lena's gallery became a hub for alternative, underrepresented artists. She had achieved what she had set out to do, not just for herself, but for the artists who had been told that their voices didn't matter. The tides had shifted, but it wasn't just about the success of the gallery anymore. It was about something much larger. Lena was now a symbol of resistance, someone who had fought against a system of exclusion and had created space for others to thrive. Her success didn't go unnoticed by the media. Documentaries were made. Interviews poured in. Lena, who had once been the quiet assistant curator, was now being invited to speak at conferences advocating for inclusivity and equity in the art world. One evening, as she sat in her office, watching the city lights through her window, Lena received a knock at the door. It was Leopold Franco. "You did it," he said, walking in with a grin. He had always been the quiet supporter, but tonight, something about his presence felt different. There was a warmth in his eyes, pride. "We did it," Lena corrected him. "It wasn't just me. It was the artists, the community, it's everyone who believed in this." Leopold smiled. "You've made a real change, Lena. The world is listening now. You've become the voice they were waiting for." Lena felt the weight of those words. She had become the voice, not just of a movement, but of a world she had never fully been a part of, but was now shaping with her own hands. Months had passed since the collaboration with Christie's, and Lena's world had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The gallery, the voice of art, had become a landmark, a testament to the power of inclusivity and the belief that art was meant to speak to everyone, not just the elite. She had not only broken through the barriers of a world built on privilege, but she had created a new space where every artist could be seen, especially those whose work had been overlooked, suppressed, or dismissed. Yet, as Lena stood in front of her gallery, looking at the ever-expanding collection of diverse artists, she realized that she had begun to do something far bigger than she had originally intended. It wasn't just about showing art. It wasn't just about giving those marginalized voices a place to be heard. It was about redefining the very nature of what art could be and who had the power to create it, share it, and appreciate it. It had been a quiet evening, and as the final visitors trickled out, Lena couldn't help but take a moment to breathe in the stillness of the gallery. It had been a year since she had taken the risk and opened the doors of this new world she was building. A year of struggles, sleepless nights, and doubts, but also a year of triumphs. Triumphs that had finally made her feel seen. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Leopold Franco, who had become not just a mentor, but a true friend throughout this entire journey. He entered the gallery with his signature quiet demeanor, but there was something about his presence tonight, a sense of finality. His steps were slower than usual, and he carried something in his hands, a large canvas covered with a cloth. "Lena," he said softly, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what we've built here. This gallery, this movement, it's not just a chapter in our lives. It's part of something much bigger. Lena smiled, walking over to the canvas. I know what you mean, Leopold. It's hard to believe how far we've come, considering where we started. A year ago, I wasn't even sure this place would survive. Leopold chuckled, but there was a touch of nostalgia in his eyes. You were always stronger than you gave yourself credit for. And that's what this is about. You didn't just change the art world. You made people believe that art could be more than a commodity. It could be a tool for social change. Lena felt a warm rush of pride, though she couldn't help but feel a tinge of guilt. This had never been easy, and she knew the road ahead wouldn't be either. The art world was slow to change, and she had often felt like an outsider fighting against an overwhelming system. But then she thought about the artists, the ones who had been silenced, the ones who had stepped forward and shared their stories through their work. They were the reason she kept going, the reason this space existed in the first place. Leopold cleared his throat, breaking her thoughts. I've been working on something, he said, slowly pulling the cloth off the canvas. The painting beneath, it took Lena's breath away. It was her. The portrait of Lena Matthews, standing tall in the middle of the gallery, with an expression of quiet strength and determination, looked back at her from the canvas. It wasn't just a likeness, it was a representation of everything she had become over the past year. The strokes were bold, yet delicate, capturing the balance between vulnerability and power. There were splashes of colors, reminiscent of the work of the artists she had championed. It felt like a tribute to the movement she had created. Leopold, Lena whispered, her voice caught in her throat. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Leopold replied, his voice soft. This is for you, Lena. This is to remind you of what you've achieved, to remind you of the legacy you're leaving. You've shown the world what it means to stand up, to fight for something that matters. Lena stood there in silence, gazing at the portrait. For the first time, she saw herself not just as a curator, not just as someone fighting for space in the art world, but as a leader, someone who had inspired others, someone whose actions had created real change. As Lena continued to admire the painting, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from one of her longtime friends, a fellow artist who had joined her gallery's initiative. The message was simple, but it struck deep. I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. The world has started listening. You've made a space for us, a space where we belong. You've given us a future, Lena. A future we didn't know was possible. I'll forever be grateful. Lena blinked away a tear as she read the message. This was it. This was what she had worked for, fought for. This was her legacy. Later that evening, as Lena stood in the gallery, looking around at the space that had come to mean so much to her, she received another unexpected visitor. Samantha Miller, the woman who had once fired her, who had dismissed her as nothing more than a threat to the museum's reputation, stood at the entrance of the gallery, looking at her with a mixture of hesitation and respect. Lena didn't say anything at first. She didn't know what to expect. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure there was room for reconciliation. But then Samantha spoke. I see what you've done here, she said softly, her voice a little strained. I didn't understand it at first, Lena. I didn't see your vision. But now, I see it. I see what you've created. Lena felt her heart tighten, but she stood firm, her gaze steady. It's not about what you see, Samantha. It's about who gets to be seen. Samantha nodded, her gaze falling to the artwork on the walls. I was wrong to fire you, she admitted, but what you've done here, it's bigger than anything I could have imagined. The art world needs this. The world needs this. Lena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had been through. It wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. It was about something deeper, about recognizing the value of her work and the impact it was having. She didn't need Samantha's validation anymore, but hearing it still meant something. Thank you, Samantha, Lena said, her voice steady. But what matters now is the artists, the voices that have been silenced for too long. Samantha nodded, her eyes reflecting a new understanding. I'll make sure they're heard. As Samantha left, Lena stood alone in the gallery, the weight of the moment settling in. She had come so far. She had fought for her vision, for her artists, and for the truth. And now, she realized the work was just beginning. Lena smiled softly, looking at the portrait of herself on the wall. This was the legacy she was building, a legacy that would outlast the barriers, the walls, and the systems that had once tried to keep her out. Lena stood in front of the large windows of her gallery, gazing out at the city that had always seemed too big, too overwhelming. But now, as she looked out at the twinkling lights below, the world felt different. Her world felt different. It wasn't just the physical space she had created, but the ripple effects of her work, her vision, that were now reaching far beyond the walls of the Voice of Art. The emails had been pouring in since the night of the auction. Collectors, artists, and critics from all over the world had been reaching out, expressing their support. They wanted to be a part of the movement she had started. The art world, long governed by exclusivity and elitism, was beginning to open its doors. Lena had expected resistance, but what she hadn't anticipated was the wave of support from all corners of society. What had begun as a small act of defiance, a single step toward inclusivity, was now spreading like wildfire. The Voice of Art had become a symbol, not just for artists, but for anyone who had ever been excluded from a system that wasn't built for them. It wasn't long before Lena was invited to speak at major art institutions, universities, and conferences. People wanted to hear her story. They wanted to know how one person, one curator, had managed to dismantle the barriers of an industry that had been so resistant to change. She spoke about her journey, about the obstacles she had faced, about the importance of giving space to voices that had been silenced. She talked about the need for art to reflect the diversity of the world, to tell the stories that were often ignored in favor of mainstream narratives. Her words resonated with everyone she spoke to, and she could feel it, the shift in the air. The ripple effects weren't just felt in the art world, though. Social justice movements and activists began to take notice, too. Lena's work with marginalized artists, those whose voices were often silenced by the establishment, became a case study in what happens when the excluded are given a platform. Her story of empowerment was shared across social media, used in classrooms, cited in articles. People all over the world began to see what could be achieved when they stood up for change. Lena's voice had become a beacon for those who had been left behind, whether in the art world or beyond it. One day, as Lena was sitting in her office, reviewing some of the latest proposals for upcoming exhibits, a message came through. It was an invitation to speak at the United Nations Annual Cultural Summit. The invitation was surreal, but it was also a culmination of everything she had been working toward. It wasn't just about art anymore. It was about the global impact of inclusion, equality, and diversity. Lena stared at the invitation, her heart racing. This was a sign. It was the recognition she had dreamed of, but it was also a challenge to continue pushing for change, to make sure that her work and the work of the artists she believed in was not just a passing moment, but a lasting movement. When the time came for her speech at the summit, Lena stood in front of a crowd of diplomats, artists, and global leaders. The weight of the moment didn't escape her. She had started this journey as someone who felt invisible, but now here she was, standing on a world stage, about to speak about the power of art and its ability to change the world. Art is a reflection of our humanity, Lena began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. It is the mirror through which we see not just our culture, but our values. And right now, our values are failing those who don't fit into the narrow definitions of success and acceptance. Art should be a space where we all belong, where every story is told, where no voice is left behind. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. The faces before her were diverse, each one carrying a different story, a different perspective. But the art world is changing, she continued, and I believe deeply that change begins when we give those who are forgotten a place at the table, when we listen to their stories, understand their truths, and allow them to be seen. That is when we truly honor what art is. Lena could see the effect her words were having on the audience. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. It was about those artists, those stories, those voices that had been silenced for far too long. After the speech, Lena was swarmed by media representatives and art professionals who wanted to speak with her. For the first time, though, it wasn't just about her story, it was about the movement she had sparked. As she was interviewed by an international news outlet, the journalist asked her, "What's next for you, Lena? What do you want your legacy to be?" Lena smiled, her heart full as she spoke. "My legacy isn't just about creating space for myself. It's about creating space for everyone. For artists who were told they didn't matter, for stories that were dismissed as irrelevant. I want to be remembered as someone who showed the world that art can be a tool for social change, for healing, for unity, and that everyone deserves a place in that story." The response to Lena's speech was overwhelming. Her name spread across headlines, and the art world finally began to see what she had been trying to show all along. The Voice of Art became one of the most respected galleries in the world, a place where true artistic expression thrived, no longer confined to the boundaries set by wealth and status. Leopold Franco's work continued to rise in value, and artists from all over the world reached out to Lena, wanting to be a part of her vision. They no longer had to hide their stories, they no longer had to be invisible. Lena had made sure of that. One evening, as Lena sat in her office, her gaze falling on the portrait of herself that Leopold had painted for her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The journey had been long, and the road had been hard, but she had made it, and she hadn't just made it for herself, she had made it for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The gallery was quiet now, the last of the guests long gone. The lights dimmed in the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Lena stood alone in the center, her gaze fixed on the paintings around her, each piece telling its own story, each one a testament to the voices she had fought so hard to amplify. She had come so far, from the assistant curator fired for helping a homeless man, to now being one of the most powerful and influential voices in the art world. Her journey had been one of immense growth, but it hadn't been easy. She had faced opposition from all sides, dealt with rejection, and experienced loss. But now, looking around at the walls filled with vibrant, emotional artwork, Lena could feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a real difference. The evening was calm, the museum's energy having shifted from the frenetic rush of an opening to the stillness that followed the storm of success. The artists she had worked with, the ones who had trusted her vision, were now being recognized for the greatness she had always known was within them. And the world was finally seeing it. They were all being seen. But there was something else, a sense of peace that Lena had never quite experienced before. As she walked through the gallery, her fingers brushing lightly against the frames, she allowed herself to think back on the many years of hard work, the long nights spent curating exhibits, meeting deadlines, organizing events, the struggle to be heard, and how, through all of it, she had never given up. And now, her legacy wasn't just about the art on the walls. It was about the change she had brought to an industry that had so long been a barrier to many. It wasn't long before the door opened, and Leopold Franco stepped into the gallery. His familiar, quiet presence always brought a sense of calm to Lena. Though their journeys had been different, his words and actions had meant the world to her. He had believed in her when no one else had, and now they were standing in a space that was everything they had worked for. "You've done it," Leopold said with a soft smile, walking toward her. "Look at what you've created, Lena." Lena met his gaze, her eyes brimming with emotion. "We've done it, Leopold. This isn't just me. It's everyone, the artists, the collectors, the supporters. It's a movement, a place for the voices that have been silenced." Leopold nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You were always meant for this. You were meant to lead, to create something bigger than yourself. And now, this place, this gallery, it's proof that you were right. The world is listening now." Lena smiled, but it was bittersweet. "I never thought it would happen this way, Leopold. I thought I would always be an outsider, always fighting for a place at the table. But now, I think I've built my own table." They both looked around the gallery, where pieces by Aisha, Jamal, Sarah, and so many others hung on the walls. Each piece was not just an artwork, it was a defiant statement, a loud shout into a world that had too often ignored the voices of the marginalized. As the evening grew later, the museum staff began to prepare to close for the night. Lena stood by the large windows, looking out at the city skyline. The same view she had seen so many times before, the one that had once seemed so far out of reach, so foreign, so impossible. But now, the city felt like home. Lena had built a home, a place where her dreams had taken root and blossomed. She had fought and she had won. You did it, Lena. You changed everything. The voice came from behind her. It was Samantha Miller. Lena turned to face her former boss, the woman who had once fired her, who had been so dismissive of her efforts. But now, standing in front of her, Samantha looked different. She wasn't the cold, distant curator who had once judged Lena for having the courage to stand up for what was right. Samantha had changed, too. I didn't think it would happen, Samantha said, her tone softer than Lena remembered. When I fired you, I thought that was the end. I thought I was right. But I see now you were right. This is the future of art. This is the future of the world. Lena nodded. She had expected anger, maybe resentment from Samantha, but what she received was respect. Respect for the courage it had taken to create change. You were wrong to fire me, Lena said, her voice calm but firm. But I understand now that it wasn't about me. It was about the system you and others have been a part of, a system that has kept so many from having a chance. This space, it's not about me. It's about everyone who has ever been silenced. Samantha's eyes softened. I've learned that the hard way, she admitted, but I see now that this is the change we need. Lena didn't respond right away. There was no need. The words had already been spoken, and the respect between them was mutual. What mattered now was that Lena had done what she had set out to do. The doors to the gallery slowly began to close for the night, but Lena stood there, gazing out at the city. This was her moment, and it was real. She had fought against everything that tried to silence her. And now she had built something that would carry on long after she was gone. Days turned into weeks, and the world continued to respond. Lena's work with the gallery and the artists she championed had begun to reach more than just the art world. The movement she had started wasn't just about art, it was about justice, equality, and empowerment. More exhibitions followed, and the success of the Voice of Art continued to grow. Documentaries were made, articles were published, and her story became an inspiration for anyone who had ever felt like an outsider. She was no longer the new girl who had fought to be seen. She was a leader, someone whose work was changing the world. Lena's life had taken unexpected turns. She had faced betrayals, struggles, and heartbreak. But she had never wavered. She had built a legacy for herself, for the artists she had fought for, and for the many who would follow in her footsteps. As the last light of day faded into the night, Lena took one last look at the gallery. The voices of so many were represented here. The stories of those who had been forgotten, of those who had always been invisible, they were now being heard. And Lena? She had found her place in the world. She had created something that would endure. This was just the beginning.